The world exploded into noise and light. Not the distant, rumbling thunder Leonid Surov was used to sketching from his Moscow apartment, but a shrieking, tearing hell up close. Earth fountained skyward, peppering his back with frozen clods. He wasn't supposed to be here. This was a mistake. Just hours before, his commanding officer, a harried captain with bloodshot eyes, had called their unit, this strange collection of carpenters and painters, to the front line for the first time. "A test," the captain had said, "to see if your toys work under real scrutiny." Now, crouched in a shallow trench beside Boris, the cynical sound engineer, Leonid watched their creation unravel. 200 meters away, under the brutal clarity of the morning sun, their battalion of rubber and canvas tanks stood exposed. They had painted them for dusk, for the soft light of dawn, not for this surgical winter glare. A German reconnaissance plane, a twin-boomed frame, had circled once, twice, a lazy predator. Then the artillery began. A direct hit lifted a fake T-34 into the air. It did not erupt in a fireball of fuel and ammunition. It simply burst. A pathetic shrill pop, like a child's balloon at a grim festival. The painted rubber skin shredded, flapping wildly as the structure deflated into a crumpled, empty sack. Another shell landed nearby, showering the adjacent dummy with real dirt, making it look absurdly, tragically authentic in its destruction. "Art critics!" Boris yelled over the din, his voice cracking with a hysterical laugh. "They hate our exhibition." Leonid saw Pyotr, a young set designer from the Bolshoi, make a run for it. He had wanted to adjust a sagging cannon barrel to preserve the illusion until the last second. A mortar round silenced that impulse forever. Pyotr's body fell onto the fake tank's deflated flank. The contrast was obscene. The vibrant, still wet paint of simulated armor, and the dark, spreading reality of blood. This was not war as Leonid had imagined it. This was a grotesque performance where the props died alongside the stagehands. The captain gave the order to fall back. As they scrambled through the communications trench, Leonid glanced back one last time. The field was a graveyard of phantoms, each meticulously crafted ruin drawing very real, very deadly fire. The mission, he realized with cold clarity, had been a success. They had been convincingly destroyed. The cost of that convincing was Pyotr's life, and a piece of Leonid's soul. Weeks later, the memory of that field was a raw, vibrating nerve beneath his skin. Moscow felt like a dream, a silent film playing behind a pane of thick glass. His mother's apartment was a sanctuary of quiet despair, the space where his father's absence was a physical presence. Leonid's own war seemed both over and yet horrifyingly incomplete. He was a soldier who had seen combat, but his only weapon had been a brush. The official-looking envelope delivered by the stone-faced female courier felt like a verdict. It was not from his old unit. The orders were chillingly specific. Report alone at midnight to a deserted tram depot at the city's edge. Bring personal drafting tools. Tell no one. His mother's kiss goodbye felt like a last rite. The journey was a descent into paranoia. A closed truck with no windows, then a transfer to a windowless van. For the final leg, a blindfold. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel on an isolated road, the barking of distant, unseen dogs. When the blindfold was removed, he stood blinking in the harsh light of an aircraft hangar buried deep in a pine forest. The air smelled of pine resin, fresh paint, and ozone from welding arcs. Around him, 60 other men milled in anxious clusters, architects with precise hands, radio operators with the watchful eyes of listeners, theater prop masters, magicians from Moscow stages, even a few grim-faced professional forgers. The rumor, whispered in fear, was that they were all being gathered as expendable specialists for a suicide mission, or worse, as traitors to be processed out of sight. The tension shattered with the arrival of Major Yegorov. He moved like a wolf through tall grass, silent, purposeful, radiating an energy that was neither front-line brutality nor rear-echelon pomp. His eyes were the most striking feature, pale, analytical, missing nothing. They scanned the room and settled on individuals, not as people, but as instruments to be assessed for a specific task. He did not shout. His voice, when it came, was a low, cold instrument that cut through the hangar's murmur and demanded total focus. "Your previous assignment," Yegorov began, his gaze briefly touching Leonid, as if he knew, "was a clumsy first draft, executed by fools who understood mechanics, but not psychology. You were asked to build targets. I am here to teach you to build truth." He gave a sharp nod to 2 assistants. They wheeled out a large, shrouded object on a flatbed cart. With a theatrical slowness that amplified the silence, they pulled the tarp away. Beneath it lay a crumpled, formless mass of olive-drab rubber. A hose was connected. A compressor coughed to life. The transformation was mesmerizing, almost obscene. The shapeless mass began to stir, to breathe. It swelled with a low, constant hiss. A turret took form, then a gun barrel, the distinctive sloped armor of a Soviet KV-1 heavy tank. Within minutes, a perfect, full-scale replica stood before them, gleaming under the hangar lights. The paintwork was a masterpiece of deception, subtle gradients of wear, authentic mud splatter patterns replicated from photographs, realistic dust accumulation on horizontal surfaces. It was a stunning feat of hyper-realistic art. A murmur of admiration rippled through the men. Then Yegorov moved. In one fluid motion, he unslung the Mosin Nagant rifle from his shoulder, reversed it, and with brutal, deliberate force, drove the bayonet into the tank's flank. The sound was a visceral shock. A loud, vulgar shh. The magnificent war machine shuddered. Its form wavered, the proud gun barrel drooping like a dying flower. It crumpled in on itself, with a pathetic, sighing wheeze, collapsing back into a heap of worthless fabric. The entire process took 15 seconds. The hangar was now tomb-silent, the men staring at the deflated carcass as if witnessing a murder. Yegorov planted the butt of his rifle on the concrete floor, the bayonet still pointing upward. "That," he said, his voice devoid of any triumph, only grim finality, "is the only thing you are creating. Hollow truths, convincing lies. Your enemy has the finest optical lenses, the best radio intercept units, the most meticulous analysts in the world. They believe in logic, in evidence, in what they can see and hear. Your task is not to hide an army. It is to invent one, to paint it on the canvas of their perception so vividly, so flawlessly, that they will stake the lives of their real soldiers, their real panzers, on its destruction." He paced slowly before the ruined dummy, his boots scuffing the concrete. "You are no longer painters? You are no longer engineers? You are apparatchiks of illusion? You will work in the dark? You will receive no medals for the battles your phantoms fight. Your victory will be measured in the tonnage of bombs wasted on empty fields, in the enemy divisions sent in the wrong direction, in the lives of our real soldiers, saved because the blow intended for them fell upon your creations. Leonid's fingers, stained with the charcoal of 1,000 quiet sketches, twitched at his side. He looked from the shameful pile of rubber to the intense, unforgiving face of Major Yegorov. The memory of Pyotr's body on the fake tank fused with the image of the bayoneted replica. This was the crucible. This was the brutal, elegant, terrifying answer to the chaotic violence of that first test. He was not being offered a safe post. He was being recruited into a shadow war where the currency was belief and the cost of a mistake was counted in the blood of others, not just their own. A strange, cold fire ignited in his gut. This was not what he had expected. It was infinitely more dangerous, more complex, and more horrifyingly fascinating. The hangar in the forest ceased to be a holding pen and became a factory of dreams. Not the hopeful kind, but the kind you have in a fever. Lucid, detailed, and with consequences that linger upon waking. Major Yegorov's initiation by bayonet had stripped away any lingering illusion of safety or secondary importance. They were now raw material, to be forged into something new. Leonid's group, now officially designated as the 23rd Special Purpose Regiment, a bland, bureaucratic title that masked its bizarre reality, was plunged into a regimen that was part art school, part commando training, and part theater rehearsal, all conducted under a blanket of suffocating secrecy. The first lesson was compartmentalization. The hangar was divided into sealed workshops, each a world of its own specialized madness. Leonid was assigned to the Visual Deception Unit, a cavernous space that smelled of turpentine, hot rubber, and freshly cut lumber. Here, the inflatable tanks were just the beginning. Carpenters constructed skeletal frames for dummy airplanes, wooden ribs over which canvas skins were stretched and painted with a meticulous eye for light and shadow. Engineers designed collapsible howitzers from sheet metal and pipe, which could be assembled by a small crew in 20 silent minutes under cover of darkness. Leonid's primary instructor was a man named Felix, a former professor of architecture from Leningrad, who had lost his family in the siege. Felix's grief had been refined into a fanatical obsession with structural deceit. He lectured not on aesthetics, but on the physics of deception. "Forget beauty," Felix would say, his voice a dry rasp as he guided Leonid's hand. "Think of the sun. A real tank casts a specific shadow, a specific heat signature. A flat painting on the ground is a joke. Your creation must have volume. It must interact with light as a solid object would. This curve here," he would point to the subtle bulge of a dummy truck's canvas fender, "is not for realism. It is to catch the low-angle light of dawn at 0600 hours, as seen from a Focke-Wulf reconnaissance plane flying at 3,000 meters. You are not painting an object. You are painting a moment." Failure was not academic. One day, a team's dummy supply depot, constructed from painted tarpaulins and cleverly stacked crates, was deemed flat by Felix, after reviewing aerial photographs taken by their own internal evaluation plane. The entire structure was condemned. The team was forced to dismantle it and rebuild it under the open sky, in the driving rain, through the night. The lesson was brutal. A flaw invisible from the ground was a beacon from the air. A beacon meant discovery. Discovery meant death, not just for them, but for the real troops they were meant to shield. Beyond the visual workshop was the acoustic platoon, a realm of eerie soundscapes sealed in a soundproofed bunker. Here, Boris, the cynical engineer, found his twisted calling. His domain was a jungle of magnetic wire recorders, amplifiers, and giant horn speakers mounted on trucks. He and his team traveled to real frontline sectors, risking sniper fire to capture the authentic, layered symphony of war. The specific diesel growl of a T-34's V2 engine starting up, the metallic clatter of tank tracks on gravel, the distant shout of a platoon commander, the dull thud of spades digging entrenchments. These sounds were not merely recorded. They were catalogued, edited, and orchestrated. Leonid was permitted to observe one night. From a hidden observation post, he watched as Boris's team, using nothing but their speaker trucks and a complex schedule, brought a ghost regiment to life in an empty meadow. First, the distant grumble of engines approaching, then the clank and squeal of tracks as the invisible tanks parked, the slamming of hatches, the murmur of voices, the ring of a hammer on metal for maintenance. For 4 hours, the meadow was alive with the sounds of an armored unit bedding down. At 0400, the engines roared back to life, and the sounds faded convincingly into the distance, simulating a dawn departure. It was a radio play for an audience of German listening posts, a masterpiece of auditory fiction. Seeing Boris's exhausted, triumphant face in the pale morning light, Leonid understood the man's cynicism had morphed into a dark, artistic pride. The most clandestine unit was the radio games group, operating from a locked van filled with crackling equipment. These were chess players, engaged in a match where the pieces were wavelengths and the opponents were unseen German intelligence officers with cool, analytical minds. They studied captured German signal procedures, the idiosyncratic fists of enemy radio operators, their unique tapping rhythm, and the bureaucratic jargon of Wehrmacht logistics. Their task was to weave a sprawling, consistent narrative of a fictional military formation, its movements, its supply needs, its minor administrative squabbles across the airwaves. A single wrong call sign, an improperly formatted request for ammunition, could unravel the entire illusion. The pressure in that van was a palpable silent hum. Personal bonds formed in the cracks of this intense pressure. Leonid found himself drawn to Anya, a slender, severe woman who operated one of the radio sets. She rarely spoke, her focus absolute, her fingers dancing over dials with precise grace. He learned in fragments. Her entire family, in Kharkov, had been killed in a bombing raid she later identified from signal intercepts as meant for a nearby factory that had been empty for weeks. Her grief was not a wound, but a lens. She saw their work not as a game, but as precise, intellectual vengeance, a way to twist the enemy's own systems of communication and intelligence into a noose for their own troops. She saw the logic behind the art. Their first integrated field exercise was a disaster that nearly ended the unit. Tasked with simulating a forward artillery observation post for a night, the visual team erected a convincing fake command bunker. The acoustic team played the sounds of generators and field telephones. The radio team began broadcasting faint, coded artillery spotter signals. But they had neglected a fundamental rule: life leaves traces. They left no worn paths to the latrine area, no tire marks from a changing guard shift, no scattered cigarette butts or discarded food tins. A visiting frontline scout, a grizzled veteran Yegorov had brought in as a devil's advocate, pointed it out within minutes. "This place is cleaner than a hospital," he grunted. "Dead men lived here." Yegorov's fury was glacial. He did not shout. He assembled the entire regiment before the pristine, useless dummy bunker. "You are creating a corpse," he stated, his voice cutting the cold air. "A perfect, odorless, lifeless corpse. The enemy is a pathologist. He will perform an autopsy from 10 kilometers away. He will look for the mess, for the disorder of real men, tired and scared, trying to survive. Your illusion must breathe. It must sweat. It must smell. It must be alive with the details of carelessness." The lesson was branded into them. Artistry was not enough. Engineering was not enough. They had to become method actors on a continental stage, embodying the fatigue, the boredom, the sloppiness of the units they were impersonating. They had to think not as creators, but as sustainers of a living, breathing fiction. Leonid lay awake in his bunk that night, the pine logs of the barracks creaking around him. He thought of his father, an engineer who believed in the purity of function, of strength. He was engaged in the opposite pursuit, the engineering of perfect, magnificent weakness. He thought of Pyotr, the set designer, who died for a flawed illusion. He thought of Anya's focused rage, of Boris's cynical soundscapes, of Felix's grief-stricken geometry. They were all broken pieces, assembled by Yegorov into a weapon of exquisite fragility. Their canvas was the landscape of war itself, and their first major painting was due soon. The whispers had already begun, a name circulating with a mixture of dread and purpose. Kursk. A looming battle where the stakes would be measured in armies, not platoons. The workshop was preparing for its masterpiece. The summons to the command bunker felt like a physical shift in atmospheric pressure. The weeks of relentless training, the compartmentalized drills, the bitter lessons learned in failure, all of it coalesced into a single, silent understanding that hummed through the forest hangar. The theoretical was over. The ghost army was being deployed. Major Yegorov stood before a large, cloth-draped map in the chilly, concrete-lined room. The regiment's key personnel crowded in, the visual team leads like Felix, the acoustic masters like Boris, the radio wizards, and a few select operators like Anya and Leonid, whose skills in both drafting and rapid assessment had been noted. With a sharp pull, Yegorov unveiled the map. It was a detailed sector of the Central Front, north of the city of Kursk. The territory was a web of villages, forest patches, and gently rolling farmland. A thick blue pencil line, menacing and definitive, denoted the current front. Just behind it, in an area marked with dense woodland and a meandering river, Yegorov placed a single red cardboard counter. It bore no unit number, only a question mark drawn in ink. "This," Yegorov's finger tapped the counter, "is the 5th Guards Tank Army, a formidable formation. T-34s, heavy KV regiments, motorized infantry, full artillery support. It does not, in fact, exist. Not there. Not yet. And it never will." He paused, letting the scale of the lie settle. "Our task is to convince German intelligence that this phantom army is assembling in these woods, that it is the vanguard of a massive Soviet counterstrike, poised to smash their northern pincer before their Operation Citadel even begins. We have 14 days. The plan, codenamed Operacja Zerkalo, Operation Mirror, was a ballet of deception on a staggering scale, broken into phases with the precision of a military offensive. Phase 1. Infiltration and canvas preparation. That very night, under a moonless sky, advance teams of scouts and sappers would move into the designated area. Their job was not to fight, but to prepare the stage, to identify clearings that from the air would look like camouflaged vehicle parks, to mark routes for fake tank tracks, to scout positions for dummy command posts, with clear sight lines for potential German observers. Leonid found himself assigned to a visual reconnaissance team. Traveling in a silenced Gaz E-61 staff car, then on foot for the final kilometers, he slipped through the real front lines like a shadow. The world here was different from the forest workshop. This was the true frontier. The air carried the stale, metallic scent of old battles, cordite, rust, and damp earth. Distant flares painted the horizon in brief, sickly green pulses. He moved with a front-line scout named Voronin, a man who communicated in grunts and hand signals. They crawled to the edge of a large clearing near a ruined village. Through his binoculars, Leonid saw not a potential canvas, but a graveyard of the real war, the blackened skeleton of a Panzer IV, a scattered cluster of unmarked crosses. This was where their illusion would be built. "Good," Voronin whispered, his voice like gravel. "The wreckage sells it. They'll think we're hiding among the dead. But the ground, see?" He pointed to the soft, loamy soil at the clearing's edge. "Takes tracks like plaster. Your rubber toys will need to make memories here." Phase 2. The Build. 2 nights later, the main force of the 23rd Regiment descended. The quiet woodland exploded into a frenzy of silent activity. Dozens of trucks, their headlights reduced to slits of blue cellophane, disgorged their cargo. Leonid's team, working from his field sketches, directed the inflation of 22 dummy T-34s and 8 KV-1s. The hiss of the compressors was deafening in the tense quiet, every man glancing skyward, expecting the drone of a night raider. The tanks took shape, monstrous black silhouettes against the starry sky. But they were just inert shapes. Now came the artistry. Using broad, soft-bristled brushes and airbrushes connected to hand pumps, they painted the tanks not with solid color, but with light. They mixed pigments with water to create washes that simulated the way moonlight gleamed off curved armor, where deep shadow pooled in road wheels, how dust collected on horizontal surfaces. They dirtied the clearing. Using dragged logs behind trucks, they created a web of convincing tank tracks, leading into the tree line where the real vehicles were supposedly hidden under elaborate netting. They scattered real spare parts, a cracked track link, an empty oil drum stolen from a repair depot, with calculated carelessness. Simultaneously, other teams erected a fake field headquarters. It had the perfect details. A command tent, with a visible but non-functional field telephone line snaking into the woods, a parked Gaz truck with a dummy radio antenna, a carefully arranged ring of empty foxholes that suggested a perimeter. Anya's radio team, operating from a deep dugout a kilometer away, began the delicate work of birthing the phantom army's voice. At precisely 2300 hours, they initiated the first broadcast. A short, encrypted burst from the 5th Guards Tank Army HQ to the front command, reporting arrival in the assembly area and requesting clarification on fuel allotments. It was a mundane, bureaucratic seed. Phase 3. Sustaining the lie. This was the true test. The unit couldn't just build a set and leave. They had to inhabit it. Each dawn, before first light, a squad would move through the dummy positions, making subtle changes. They would alter the angles of a few dummy tank turrets, as if they had been conducting nighttime maintenance. They would add fresh vehicle tracks, with a bicycle rigged with textured rollers. They would light small, controlled fires in hidden pits to simulate field kitchens. The smell of wood smoke, and thanks to an added pinch of cheap grease, faint frying fat carrying on the morning breeze. Boris's acoustic team worked in shifts. During the day, from hidden speaker arrays, they would play the distant, muffled sounds of engine repairs, the clang of a field forge, the occasional shouted order. At night, they played the sounds of armored columns moving, but always just beyond visual range, a suggestive rumble from the forest depths. The stress was a corrosive, constant companion. Leonid existed on the knife edge of paranoia. A wandering cow from the abandoned village, stumbling into their dummy motor pool, felt like a catastrophic breach of security. The sighting of a lone German observation plane, a Fieseler Storch circling lazily at the extreme edge of visibility, sent the entire regiment into a paralysis of terror. Had they been seen? Had a shadow been wrong? Had a track pattern looked too geometrically perfect? Yegorov moved among them like a ghost himself, a corrective force. He pointed out where the netting over a hidden artillery piece was too symmetrically draped. He ordered a perfectly convincing dummy ammunition dump partially dismantled because it was too convenient to the road. He forced them to introduce flaws, the kind that real, tired soldiers would make. One afternoon, Leonid was tasked with damaging one of their showcase KV-1 dummies to explain why it hadn't moved. Using tools and paints, he created a convincing blast scar on the fender, with internal damage suggested by streaked oil stains leaking from a carefully sculpted rubber puncture. He then arranged a scene of attempted repair, tools scattered nearby, a discarded maintenance manual, a half-full cup of cold tea balanced on the track. As he stepped back, he felt a strange, perverse pride. It was a still life of deception, a narrative of failure painted for an enemy's eye. On the 10th day, the reaction came. It began not with a storm, but with a probe. German artillery, miles away, launched a ranging salvo. 2 shells whistled overhead and exploded harmlessly in an empty field 2 kilometers behind their main dummy positions. It was a question. Leonid, crouched in a slit trench near his damaged KV-1, felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The radio intercept van reported a surge in German signals traffic, analyzing the fall of shot. The next morning, the answer arrived. The deep, unrhythmic thump of heavy mortar fire. Then the scream of dive bombers, Ju-87 Stukas, their sirens wailing. They fell not on the forward Soviet trenches, but on the woodland stage the 23rd Regiment had built. Explosions walked through the dummy tank park. A direct hit vaporized one of Leonid's T-34s, the rubber shredding in a spectacular, silent puff. Shrapnel whined through the trees, cutting down fake artillery pieces. The ground shook. Through the smoke and chaos, Leonid saw Major Yegorov, standing calmly by a command post, binoculars trained on the sky, a slight, grim curve to his mouth. He was not looking at the destruction of their work. He was auditing the enemy's expenditure. The bombing lasted 20 minutes. When the last plane droned away, silence rushed back in, thick and stunned. Cautiously, men emerged from their shelters. The clearing was a mess of cratered earth, splintered trees, and the deflated, torn carcasses of their creations. Smoke curled from the fake headquarters. It was a scene of perfect, convincing devastation. A cheer started among the sappers, a raw, relieved sound. They had done it. They had drawn fire. They had saved a real unit somewhere from this onslaught. Leonid looked at the cheering men, then at the wreck of his beautifully damaged KV-1, now blown in half. He felt no triumph, only a hollow, icy, understanding. They had not won a battle. They had successfully become a target. This was their victory, to be convincingly, thoroughly destroyed. The Ghost Army had fought its first engagement, and it had lost spectacularly, just as planned. He caught Anya's eye across the smoldering clearing. She gave a single, slow nod. Her expression was not of celebration, but of cold, hard satisfaction. The vengeance was mathematical. The bombs that fell here were not falling on Kharkov. The ledger, in her mind, had been balanced by a fraction. The aftermath of the German bombardment was not a scene of victory, but of a macabre art installation titled Defeat. The clearing stank of cordite, scorched rubber, and freshly splintered pine. Leonid picked his way through the carnage. His beautifully crafted dummy KV-1, the one with the staged repair scene, now lay in two distinct pieces. The rubber armor was curled inward like a burned flower petal, the carefully painted oil stains now obscured by real grime from the explosion. It was the corpse of a fiction, and its death had been brutally convincing. Major Yegorov did not allow for reflection. While smoke still coiled into the gray dawn sky, he moved through the scattered teams, his voice a low, relentless drill. Assessment teams. Now. I want a crater analysis. I want shrapnel distribution mapped. I want to know exactly what they saw, what they believe they hit. This was not about cleanup. It was a forensic audit of their own deception. Sappers began marking craters, noting the caliber of bombs used. The visual teams, Leonid among them, documented the damage with sketchpads and cameras, studying the pattern of destruction. A cluster of craters centered on the dummy command post indicated precise targeting. The scattered hits on the fake tank park suggested they had bought the presence of concealed armor. The intelligence was priceless. It revealed what parts of their illusion had been most credible to the enemy's aerial photographers. But the cost of this credibility was etched in the strained faces around him. The relentless tension of the 2-week operation, culminating in the visceral terror of the bombing, had scraped nerves raw. Pyotr's ghost from that first, failed test seemed to walk among the shredded rubber. The men of the 23rd Regiment had not just built dummies, they had imbued them with a narrative, and watching that narrative be violently erased triggered a strange collective grief. They were stage managers mourning a demolished set, but a set that had, for a critical moment, rewritten a small part of the war's reality. The return to the forest base camp was not a triumphant homecoming. It was a retreat into exhaustion and simmering doubt. The hangar, once a workshop of potential, now felt like a decompression chamber. The euphoria some felt at having fooled the Germans curdled into a darker understanding. Boris, cradling a wire recorder damaged by concussive blast, muttered not about success, but about the decibel level of the next explosion and how to accurately replicate the sound of a direct hit on a canvas airplane. His cynicism had deepened into a morbid, technical obsession. Leonid sought solace in the routine of repair and maintenance. He was meticulously repainting a salvaged dummy turret when Anya found him. She moved with a new kind of stillness. The radio operator's constant tension slightly eased. She didn't speak of the bombing. Instead, she showed him a decoded intercept, a dry German logistical report. It noted the successful suppression of a suspected Soviet armored assembly area in grid sector Gamma 7, and recommended no further heavy munitions be diverted to that zone. Her finger tapped the phrase suspected and then successful suppression. "This," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "is our medal. Their certainty that they neutralized a threat that was never there. They have closed the file." For her, this bureaucratic footnote was a sublime victory, the quiet sealing of a trap she had helped bait. Yet, for Leonid, the victory felt hollow. He had painted a target, and men had risked their lives, and one had died back at the beginning, to make that target believable. He was an artist whose greatest work was measured by the tonnage of high explosives used to obliterate it. He found himself sketching not plans for new dummies, but the faces of the men in the unit. Felix's gaunt, focused intensity, Boris's sardonic smirk, Voronin the scout's weathered scowl. He was documenting the real human machinery behind the illusion. This internal crisis came to a head during a mandatory regimental briefing. Yegorov addressed them not with praise, but with cold, analytical correction. He flashed aerial photographs, taken by their own spotter planes, of their handiwork, before and after the bombing. "Good," he stated, "but not flawless. The track patterns leading into the eastern wood line were too repetitive. A pattern implies procedure. In chaos, tracks are chaotic. Your vehicle dispersion was mathematically ideal for concealment, not tactically ideal for defense. A real commander would have clustered his heavies here, near the cover of this ravine." He was criticizing their fiction for lacking military nuance, for failing the logic test of a truly experienced enemy analyst. The message was clear. Their next performance would be scrutinized by an even more discerning audience. The heaviest blow landed next. Yegorov unveiled a new map. It showed a vast swath of front line, not a localized sector. The success of this tactical deception has confirmed the strategic value of our methodology. Stavka has issued new orders. Our next task is not to simulate a regiment or even a corps. His pointer tapped the map. Our task is to invent an entire front. A wave of stunned silence washed over the hangar. The scale was incomprehensible. They had just managed a phantom brigade. Now they were to conjure an army group. "Operation Bagration is in its early planning stages," Yegorov continued, his voice devoid of any grandeur, making the epic sound like a complex engineering schematic. "A massive offensive to reclaim Belarusia. For it to succeed, the German reserves must be pinned down, misdirected, convinced the main blow will fall elsewhere. Our regiment will be split into mobile detachments. We will travel hundreds of kilometers. We will create not just tank formations but airfields, supply depots, railway terminals full of non-existent trains. We will simulate the radio traffic of entire armies, preparing for an offensive that will never come in the places they expect." The weight of it pressed down on Leonid's shoulders. This was no longer a clever trick. It was a fundamental, grotesque manipulation of reality on a continental scale. The personal cost crystallized in a single, devastating moment after the briefing. He was approached by a quiet, older soldier from the transport pool, a man named Grigory, who had lost 2 sons at Stalingrad. The man pressed a worn photograph into Leonid's hand. It showed 2 smiling young men in tankers' uniforms. "My boys," Grigory said, his voice thick. "They were in real T-34s, the metal kind. I drive trucks full of rubber ones." He looked at Leonid, his eyes wells of unbearable pain and a desperate, fragile hope. "The next place you draw your pictures, make it good, artist. Make them believe the storm is coming there, so that the real storm, when it comes, finds fewer fathers who have to bury their sons." Grigory walked away, leaving Leonid holding the photograph as if it were a live grenade. The abstract notion of saving lives evaporated. It was replaced by the specific, crushing weight of Grigori's hope, of the faces of his dead sons. Leonid's art was no longer about deception. It was about deflection, about using shadows and sound and carefully crafted lies to pull the fury of war away from real, breathing men like Grigori's lost boys. He looked across the hangar at his comrades, at Felix, who built to outrun his grief from Leningrad, at Boris, who weaponized sound as his protest, at Anya, whose vengeance was woven into radio waves, and at Yegorov, the master illusionist, who carried the strategic fate of millions in his plans. They were all broken, haunted people, and their brokenness was the precise tool needed for this horrifying, magnificent task. Leonid returned to his bunk, the photograph of the two tankers on his small table. He picked up his charcoal. He did not begin drafting a new dummy or a fake airfield. He stared at the blank page. The ghosts they were asked to create were no longer just rubber and wire. They were now vessels for the hopes of the living and the memory of the dead. The canvas had expanded to encompass the entire Eastern Front, and the price of a mistake was no longer a failed exercise. It was a river of blood flowing in the wrong direction. The workshop of phantoms was closing. They were now leaving to haunt the world for real. The forest base did not empty. It dissolved. The 23rd Special Purpose Regiment underwent a metamorphosis, shedding its singular form to become a virus of deception, spreading silently across the breadth of the Soviet rear. Leonid's unit, designated Detachment Gamma, was assigned to the marshy, forested region of the Pripyat Basin, hundreds of kilometers from Kursk. Their objective was not to fortify a position, but to suggest the birth of a colossal offensive force where the land itself resisted the very idea of an army. Travel was a lesson in existential dislocation. They moved in civilian trucks, their equipment crated and marked as theatrical props or agricultural machinery. They wore a mix of uniforms without clear insignia, becoming phantoms in the logistical bloodstream of the Red Army. The landscape they entered was a world of water and whispering reeds, of spongy ground that swallowed sound and ambition alike. It was the antithesis of the tank country around Kursk, which, as Major Yegorov, now overseeing the entire dispersed operation via coded signals, had coldly noted, was precisely the point. The enemy expects logic. We will give them audacity. We will make them believe we are preparing to perform the impossible. The canvas was impossibly vast. Reconnaissance revealed not clearings but bogs, not commanding hills, but low, tree-covered hummocks. Felix, his architect's mind feverish with the challenge, became a composer of negative space. "We cannot build where an army would logically build," he declared, his eyes scanning aerial photographs. "So we will build where only a desperate or brilliantly reckless army would attempt to build. We will create evidence of that desperation." The work was a quantum leap in complexity and physical toll. Phase 1 was not construction, but terraforming. Sappers, working in the sucking mire under mosquito-clouded nights, laid corduroy roads, not of sturdy logs for real tanks, but of woven branches and thinly covered peat, meant to look like serious engineering effort from the air, but which would collapse under a truck's true weight. They dug gun emplacements that slowly filled with black water, creating perfect, circular shadows on reconnaissance photos. They widened forest trails into tank avenues by selectively cutting trees in a pattern that mimicked the passage of heavy vehicles, leaving deliberate, chaotic scars on the earth and piles of cleared brush that were, in fact, carefully arranged hollow facades. Leonid's visual team now worked on an industrial scale. Their inflatable tanks and trucks were only the stars of the show. The supporting cast was the environment itself. They manufactured camouflage on a staggering scale. Acres of fishnet, strung between trees, hung with thousands of hand-cut fabric leaves in the precise autumn colors of the surrounding foliage. From the air, it would read as a concerted, massive effort to hide something vast beneath the canopy. They painted shadows onto the ground where there were no objects to cast them. Long, tank-shaped stretches of darker pigment under the nets, visible only through stereoscopic analysis. They built dummy pontoon bridges that spanned narrow channels of the Pripyat River, structures that looked robust from a distance but were, in reality, floating on partially submerged empty barrels, swaying perilously with the current. Boris's acoustic war entered a symphonic phase. The soundscape of the fake Second Shock Army had to be a sprawling, layered epic. He positioned his speaker trucks not in one location, but in a moving, rotating schedule across dozens of square kilometers. One night, the forests to the north would rumble with the sound of tracked vehicles moving into position. The next, the sounds would emanate from the east, the distant pile-driving thuds of bridge construction, the whine of sawmills processing timber for fortifications. He created the auditory illusion of a force not stationary, but preparing, shifting its weight like a giant finding its footing. The recordings of real army life were played at low volume, constantly, from hidden speakers near the dummy kitchens and latrines. The coughs, the fragments of song, the clatter of mess tins, a perpetual murmur of ghostly garrison life. Anya's radio operators became playwrights for an audience of German cryptographers. They now managed a network of 10 fake headquarters, each with its own call signs, its own logistical quirks, its own personality conflicts between fictional commanders. Traffic was a delicate balance, enough to suggest intense activity, but not so much as to seem like a meaningless cacophony. They broadcast complaints about the soggy ground stalling supplies, requests for specialized bridging equipment, reports of encounters with non-existent German patrols. They fed the enemy a coherent, frustrating, and utterly convincing narrative of a massive army grappling with a difficult landscape, inching towards a jump-off point. The human cost of sustaining this grand illusion was brutal. The men lived in a state of perpetual damp exhaustion. The mosquitoes were a torment. The constant low-grade fear of discovery by a stray patrol or a too-curious local was paralyzing. Trust frayed. A visual team, working to deadline, accidentally left a modern paint can in a dummy WWI-era gun position. Yegorov, visiting on a surprise inspection, found it. His punishment was not a rebuke, but a silent, searing lesson. He forced the entire team to spend the next 48 hours introducing an equal number of authentic, period-correct artifacts: a rusted Tsarist-era canteen, a broken Mosin-Nagant stock, scavenged from real battlefields miles away into all their positions. The lesson was about total environmental consistency, down to the last archaeological detail. Leonid found his own breaking point during a driving rainstorm. He was trying to repair a leaking inflatable artillery piece, the cold water mixing with the paint on his hands, turning them into a frozen, numb mess. The absurdity of it overwhelmed him. risking frostbite to fix a fake gun that was meant to be destroyed, in a fake army that didn't exist, in the middle of a quagmire. He looked at his ruined hands, the tools of his supposed trade, and felt a wave of nihilistic despair. What was the point of this magnificent, backbreaking lie? He sought out Anya in the radio van, a bubble of static and focused energy in the dripping forest. She was monitoring German traffic. Without a word, she handed him a headphones. He listened to the crisp, efficient German of an enemy intelligence officer summarizing the situation. The voice was calm, assured. It reported confirmed and extensive preparations by the Soviet Second Shock Army in the Pripyat sector, noting significant engineering obstacles and probable delayed offensive timetable, concluding with a recommendation to reinforce the defensive lines opposite this Schwerpunkt, the main point of effort. Hearing the enemy voice articulate their fiction as concrete fact was a psychic shock. The despair evaporated, replaced by a vertiginous sense of power. Their paint, their recordings, their fake radio signals had directly edited the reality inside that German officer's mind. They had inserted a phantom army into his strategic calculus. Leonid looked from Anya's intense, satisfied face to his own paint-stained hands. These were not the hands of a pointless decorator. They were the hands of a forger, and the document they were forging was the enemy's own battle plan. The exhaustion, the mud, the mosquitoes. It was all ink. The grand, terrible art was working. The masterpiece of mirrors was reflecting an army of ghosts so convincingly the enemy was readying its real shells to fight them. The stage for Operation Bagration was being cleared, one meticulously crafted lie at a time. The Pripyat mirage had solidified into a chilling certainty for German high command. The proof was no longer in their own intercepted reports, but in the escalating reactions of the enemy. Reconnaissance flights over the marshes became a daily torment. The high-altitude German planes etching contrails across the sky like the slow drag of a scalpel. Each pass was an examination. The men of Detachment Gamma learned to freeze in place, becoming part of the set, their hearts hammering against their ribs as the distant drone dissected their handiwork from thousands of meters above. Then the probes began, not with bombs, but with shadows. Small teams of German ground scouts, Abwehr commandos, or elite Brandenburgers began to infiltrate the periphery of their vast, imaginary army. The first evidence was subtle. A tripwire left near a dummy supply depot was found severed by a clean cut, not weather. A carefully arranged pile of discarded ration tins near a fake field kitchen had been disturbed. One can turned over to verify it was empty. The enemy was no longer relying on photographs and radio waves. They were sending men to touch the illusion, to feel its substance. Major Yegorov's orders were immediate and brutal. The detachment shifted from pure construction to active counterintelligence warfare. Real, battle-hardened scout snipers from the regular army were attached to their unit. Ghosts to guard the ghosts. Voronin, the grizzled scout from Kursk, reappeared. Leading a squad of men with faces like stone, they set up overlapping fields of observation and death. Their task was not to engage in firefights, but to make the perimeter of the Phantom Army lethally real, to sell the fiction that this was a genuine, heavily guarded military installation. Leonid's role evolved under this new, deadly pressure. He was no longer just painting backdrops. He was now designing forensic evidence for close inspection. Under Voronin's instruction, he learned to create lived-in details. that would survive a cautious touch. He manufactured fake documents, water-stained maps with plausible markings, smudged leave passes, a personal letter from a fictional soldier's sweetheart, to be carelessly dropped in a latrine area. He aged materials with chemicals and abrasives, making a new canvas tent look weeks old, staining fabric with precisely mixed solutions that mimicked mildew and ground-in grease. He created dummy explosive charges with wiring that felt authentic to the touch, placed near important dummy installations. The tension was a wire stretched to breaking point. Sleep became a fragmented memory. Every rustle in the reeds was an approaching commando. Every snap of a branch was the click of a safety being released. The men operated in a state of hyper-awareness, their senses tuned to the slightest dissonance in the symphony of falsehood they had composed. The crack in the mirror finally appeared on a night choked with thick, rolling fog from the marshes. It began not with gunfire, but with silence. One of the remote acoustic posts, a speaker array simulating nighttime tank repairs, went dead. The failure protocol was immediate, but in the dead zone of radio interference caused by the fog, the alert was delayed. A two-man guard team sent to investigate failed to report back. Voronin mobilized his scouts. Leonid, due to his intimate knowledge of the sector's visual markers, was ordered to accompany them as a silent observer. They moved through the clinging white gloom like wraiths. The world was reduced to the few meters of dripping reeds visible in the beam of a shaded flashlight, the sucking sound of their boots in the muck. The silence was absolute, a void where the familiar night sounds of insects and frogs had been smothered. They found the acoustic site destroyed. The speaker truck's tires were slashed, its delicate wire recorders smashed with deliberate, professional violence. But it was the ground that told the true story. In the soft mud, illuminated by a shielded lamp, were footprints. Not the heavy, pragmatic imprint of Soviet boots, but the distinct, patterned soles of German mountain troops. And they led away, not back towards German lines, but deeper into the heart of the dummy deployment zone, towards the carefully constructed command cluster. The enemy was not retreating. They were pressing forward, conducting a ground truth verification of the intelligence bonanza they had been fed from the air and the airwaves. They were inside the illusion, and they were methodically testing its seams. A chase began, not a reckless sprint, but a slow, terrifying stalking through the fog-blind labyrinth of their own creation. Voronin's men were hunters in their own haunt, but the prey was elite, cunning, and armed with a mandate to uncover the truth. Leonid followed, his mind racing. He knew every dummy position, every fake checkpoint. He realized with dawning horror that the German team's path was taking them directly towards the sector's most vulnerable point, the hospital area. It was a collection of tents they had erected with red crosses, logically placed but lightly guarded by their standards, as even real scouts might hesitate to violate the semblance of a medical station. It was a psychological blind spot in their own design. They converged on the site just as the lead German scout, a blurred figure in the fog, was using a knife to silently slit the canvas wall of the largest tent. Inside were not wounded, but stacks of inflatable rubber tanks, deflated and folded, the unit's spares. The discovery would be undeniable. The entire edifice of the Second Shock Army would collapse in that single moment of revelation. Voronin gave a hand signal. There was no room for capture, for interrogation. The illusion had to be protected at the ultimate cost. The sound that followed was not the grand thunder of artillery they mimicked, but the sharp, wet, intimate violence of close-quarters combat. Silenced pistols coughed. Knives flashed in the weak light. Grunts of effort, the choked-off gasp of a mortal wound, the heavy thud of a body hitting the soft earth. It was over in less than a minute, a brutal, silent ballet in the fog. When it was done, Leonid stood trembling, the acrid smell of cordite and blood cutting through the damp air. He saw the bodies of 3 German scouts and one of Voronin's men, a young sniper named Kolya, who had a wife in Gorky. Kolya lay staring at the fog-shrouded sky, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. The trade was clear: 3 enemy lives for one of their own, and the preservation of a lie. But the immediate threat was over. The larger crisis remained. The Germans had sent a team. That team had vanished. Their command would want answers. A vanished team inside a supposedly massive army compound would raise alarms, not quell them. It was Leonid, in a state of shock-induced clarity, who saw the solution. He looked from the bodies, to the slit tent, to the surrounding stage they had built. "We don't hide this," he whispered, his voice raw. "We stage it." Working with frantic, grim efficiency under Voronin's command, they transformed the scene. The German bodies were stripped of identifiable insignia. Leonid and his team used their props and paints to create a new narrative. They turned the skirmish into a minor, successful defense against a sabotage attempt. They returned fire using emptied Soviet weapon casings scattered appropriately. They made the slit tent look like the Germans' target, planting a small, real explosive charge inside amidst the rubber tanks, and detonating it to create believable blast damage, suggesting the saboteurs had succeeded in destroying a medical supply cache. They left just enough ambiguous evidence, a dropped German magazine pouch, a scuffed boot print leading away, to suggest the surviving attackers had fled back to their lines after a partial success. They buried Kolya quietly, deep in the woods, with a marker that would be removed later. He became another unrecorded casualty of the invisible war. When the fog lifted the next morning, the site told a perfect, tragic, and militarily logical story. A brave but thwarted German raid on a forward medical station. It was a story the enemy high command could believe, a story that fit the pattern of intense activity around a high-value target. It even explained the radio silence from their lost team. The crack in the mirror was not sealed. It was incorporated into the mosaic, made into a deliberate flaw that made the overall picture more credible. Leonid returned to his bunk, his hands no longer stained just with paint, but with the dark soil of Kolya's grave. The grand artistic endeavor had demanded a blood sacrifice. The Phantom Army had required a real death to sustain its credibility. He understood now that the most crucial component of their deception was no longer rubber or radio waves. It was the willingness to kill and to die for a truth that did not exist. The mirror had held, but its reflection now showed the face of a man who had crossed a line from which there was no return. The artist had become an accomplice, and the masterpiece smelled of wet earth and iron. The silent burial of Kolya in the marshy soil was not an end, but a fissure that ran through the soul of Detachment Gamma. The men moved through their tasks with a new, hollowed-out efficiency. The work was no longer a challenging game of artistic one-upmanship against an abstract enemy intelligence apparatus. It had become a grim, personal vendetta against the very real commandos who had forced them to kill and die among their stage props. The blood on the ground near the dummy hospital had irrevocably bonded the illusion to reality. Major Yegorov arrived from his mobile command post within 48 hours. He did not offer condolences for Kolya. Instead, he conducted a forensic review of the staged skirmish site, his cold eyes missing no detail. He pronounced it adequate improvisation, the highest praise he ever gave. But his focus was already far beyond the perimeter of their Pripyat fiction. He brought with him new orders that carried the grim weight of the coming colossal offensive, Operation Bagration. The strategic deception was entering its most critical and brutal phase. The phantom must now bleed, Yegorov stated, addressing the exhausted, haunted men. The enemy believes a massive army is here, frustrated by terrain, but poised. They have probed, and they believe they drew blood. To make them commit their reserves, to truly freeze them in place, they must believe this phantom army is active, a clear and present danger. They must see it not just preparing, but suffering, fighting, and drawing reinforcements. The plan he unveiled was a masterpiece of callous, strategic calculus. It was codenamed Zhertva, the sacrifice. The German aerial reconnaissance had become fixated on a particular sector of their fake deployment, a simulated forward artillery battery and its associated command post, positioned on a rare piece of semi-dry ground near a bend in the river. It was a logically perfect, textbook position. Yegorov's analysis concluded the enemy had identified it as a key node. Therefore, it had to be destroyed. But not by them. And not completely. "We will offer them a target," Yegorov explained, his pointer tapping the map. "A valuable, authentic target placed within the heart of our fiction. We will allow the enemy to successfully bomb a position. They will see the wreckage, they will count the cost, and their belief in the reality of our entire imaginary army will be cemented. They will report a significant victory, and their command will breathe easier, confident. The threat is being actively neutralized." The room grasped the implication in a wave of sickening silence. They were not going to simulate destruction this time. They were going to orchestrate a real one, with real lives as the currency. The valuable, authentic target was a platoon of actual, frontline radio operators and a squad of genuine sappers, borrowed from a regular army unit under a veil of supreme secrecy. They were brought in, confused and wary, to man the command post, a real dugout reinforced with timber, housing functioning but redundant communication equipment. Around them, the men of Detachment Gamma performed their final, most awful act of set dressing. They integrated this island of reality into their sea of falsehood. Real machine gun nests were dug to protect the approaches, but their fields of fire were deliberately limited. Real but outdated munitions were stacked in a nearby dummy bunker, a tempting secondary target. They increased radio traffic from the site, making it a buzzing, verifiable hive of activity. Leonid's task was the most psychologically torturous. He was to oversee the beautification of the target zone for aerial confirmation. He and his team enhanced the site, making it look even more crucial. They painted fake priority markings on supply crates. They laid fresh, real vehicle tracks leading directly to the command post entrance. They made it shine in a military sense, like a beacon. They were painting a bullseye on the backs of the unsuspecting soldiers now occupying the position. The night before the scheduled sacrifice, Leonid could not sleep. He walked the perimeter, the weight of his complicity, a physical agony. He found Anya at her radio van, monitoring the predictable increase in German signals, intercepting their amplified transmissions from the doomed post. Her face, usually a mask of focused vengeance, was pale. She understood the arithmetic. "It is a numbers equation," she said, her voice flat, not looking at him. "One platoon, willingly placed in danger, to misdirect 10 enemy divisions, to save perhaps 50,000 of our own during Bagration. It is correct. It is also a sin." Leonid thought of Kolya's shallow grave. He thought of Grigory's sons in the photograph. He thought of the young radio operator he'd seen that afternoon, a boy from Siberia who had joked about the muddy coffee. They were all variables in Yegorov's equation. The artist had become the curator of a human sacrifice. The morning dawned clear and still, perfect bombing weather. The detachment was pulled back to a hidden observation post 2 kilometers away. The real platoon was left at the site, following their normal routines, unaware they were the featured players in the final act of a deception play. The order was given for a staged emergency radio call about a suspected German infantry probe, to add a final layer of urgent authenticity and keep the men in their positions. Then they waited. The first sign was the distant, growing thrum of aircraft engines, a sound Boris's speakers could never fully replicate in its terrifying, approaching mass. Then, specks appeared on the horizon, growing into the distinctive shapes of Ju-88 medium bombers, with a fighter escort weaving above. The lead plane tipped into its dive. The world then dissolved into sound and fury. The first bombs fell with a shrieking whistle, striking the periphery of the complex, sending geysers of black earth and shattered trees into the air. The radio in the observation post crackled with sudden, real panic from the command post, quickly silenced as the main wave hit. Direct hits walked across the dugout, the dummy artillery positions, the ammunition store. A secondary explosion erupted as the outdated munitions cooked off in a spectacular, confirming fireball. Machine gun tracers from the real defensive positions laced the sky for a few pathetic seconds before being utterly swallowed by the concussive hell. Leonid watched through binoculars, his hands shaking so violently he had to brace them against the log wall. He saw the splintered timber of the command post fly. He saw the inflated dummies nearby, his own creations, vaporized in puffs of shredded rubber. He saw men, real, living men he had smiled at hours before, obliterated, reduced to fleeting shadows in the storm of dirt and flame. The bombs kept falling, methodical, thorough, ensuring nothing in the target box survived. The sound was not a recording. It was a physical force that punched the air from his lungs and vibrated in the marrow of his bones. It lasted 7 minutes. When the bombers droned away, leaving a ringing, absolute silence in their wake, a column of thick, greasy smoke climbed straight into the windless sky, a funeral pyre for the sacrificed. No one in the observation post cheered. No one spoke. Men vomited quietly over the side of the trench. Boris stared blankly at his silent sound equipment. Anya had tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Felix, the architect, simply turned and walked into the woods, his shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the rubble. Yegorov lowered his own binoculars. His face was a granite mask. He looked at the smoke, then at his devastated, broken team. "Now," he said, his voice hoarse but unwavering. They believe, completely. The Phantom has bled real blood. The enemy will report a major tactical victory. Their reserves will stay put, watching a corpse. He paused, the only man seemingly capable of speech. The road to Minsk is now open. Leonid slid down the wall of the observation trench until he sat in the mud. He stared at his hands, which had painted the set for this slaughter. They were clean. There was no blood on them. Yet he felt drenched in it. The grand artistic vision had reached its logical, horrifying zenith. They had not just created an illusion. They had given it a beating heart. And then they had guided the enemy's hand to rip it out. The masterpiece was complete. It was perfect. It was monstrous. And it had worked. The victory was ashes in his mouth, and the ghost of the Siberian radio operator would forever murmur in the static of his dreams. They had traded their humanity for a strategic advantage, and in that smoldering crater, Leonid understood the true, unspoken name of their unit. They were not just apparatchiks of illusion. They were engineers of betrayal, and their most convincing deception was the one they had performed on their own souls. The smoke from the sacrifice site hung in the stagnant air for 2 days, a greasy black column that served as the only monument to the platoon that had died for a lie. Within the shattered remains of Detachment Gamma, the column felt like a judgment, a permanent stain on the landscape of their souls. There was no debriefing, no commendation, no moment of silence called by Yegorov. The unit simply ceased to function as a collective. Men performed their duties in a state of profound autonomic shock, breaking down equipment, deflating the few remaining dummy tanks that had escaped the bombing, their movements slow and mechanical, as if they themselves were deflating. The grand opera of deception was over, and the silence that followed was deafening. Leonid moved through the final pack-up like a sleepwalker. He rolled a canvas sheet that bore his own meticulously painted camouflage pattern, the greens and browns now smudged with real soot and mud. Each item they packed away: a speaker horn, a spool of fake telephone wire, an airbrush, felt like an artifact from a civilization that had committed a sublime and unspeakable act before vanishing. The artistic pride he had felt in the Pripyat marshes was extinct, burned away in the fireball that consumed the command post. He had used his skill not to create, but to bait a trap, not to reflect life, but to orchestrate a specific, calculated death. He wondered if his hands would ever again draw anything that wasn't a vector for destruction. Major Yegorov departed as silently as he had arrived, leaving only a stack of sealed transfer orders. The 23rd Special Purpose Regiment was to be dispersed, its men funneled into other units, its existence erased from even the most classified rosters. Their victory was too terrible, too morally ambiguous to be acknowledged. They were a toxic asset, to be diluted and forgotten. The journey back from the front was a reverse haunting. They rode in the same trucks, now laden with broken illusions instead of promising ones. They passed columns of real troops, fresh-faced regiments singing as they marched west towards the thunder that was Operation Bagration. The genuine, earth-shattering offensive their lies had helped enable. The soldiers waved, cheering the bedraggled, silent men in the trucks, mistaking their shell-shocked stillness for the weary dignity of frontline veterans. Leonid could not meet their eyes. He felt like a fraud wearing a mask of honor, carved from someone else's death. Weeks later, Leonid found himself in a makeshift barracks in Poland. reassigned as a simple draftsman to a legitimate engineering corps. The war was moving with breathtaking speed, the German front collapsing under the Soviet juggernaut. One evening he was summoned to the communications hut. A signal officer handed him a decoded message, its origin obscured but its routing clear from high command. It was not addressed to him personally, but to a list of coded designators, one of which he morbidly recognized as his own from the 23rd. The message was a single, cold paragraph of strategic summary. It detailed the catastrophic failure of German Army Group Center in the opening days of Operation Bagration. It noted, as a contributing factor, the successful fixation of substantial enemy reserves in the Pripyat sector due to convincing strategic deception operations, which presented a credible secondary threat, thereby thinning defensive lines at the primary point of impact. The casualty estimates for the enemy were listed in the tens of thousands. The numbers of Soviet lives saved were implied, never stated. This was their citation. This dry bureaucratic footnote was their medal of heroism, their Order of the Red Banner. It quantified their victory in the language of grand strategy, sanitizing the blood, the terror, the sound of the Siberian boy's last panicked transmission, the smell of Kolya's fresh-turned grave. Leonid stood holding the flimsy paper, feeling nothing. The equation was complete. The sacrifice had been validated by the abacus of war. It was correct. It had worked. The knowledge was a stone in his stomach. He sought out the only connection to that other life he could find. Through a labyrinth of field post codes, he managed to get a letter to Anya, who had been sent to a signals unit near the Baltic. Her reply came weeks later, a single sheet of paper. It contained no personal words, no reminiscence. Instead, she had transcribed in her precise, elegant hand another intercepted German communication. This one was dated just after the Bagration breakthrough. It was a furious, confused dispatch from a German corps commander whose flank had been obliterated. The key sentence was underlined. "Where is the Second Shock Army? Intelligence confirmed its presence and strength. It has vanished. Its alleged positions are empty. We were defending against a ghost." Leonid read those lines again and again. We were defending against a ghost. This was the final, perfect review of their masterpiece. Not from their own generals, but from the baffled, defeated enemy. The phantom they had painstakingly built, given breath with sound and shadow, fortified with blood and sacrifice, had not just been believed. It had commanded armies. It had held front lines. It had shaped the battle space of the real world as surely as any division of real T-34s. And then, having fulfilled its purpose, it had vanished, leaving only confusion and ruin in its wake. He folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. That night, unable to sleep, he took out his charcoal and a fresh piece of paper. For a long time, he stared at the blank surface, haunted by the ghosts of everything he had drawn before. The perfect shadows, the convincing mud, the faces of the dead. His hand began to move, but he did not draw a tank or a dummy or a landscape. He found himself sketching the men, the sharp, ravaged angles of Felix's face, the cynical set of Boris's jaw as he bent over his wire recorders, Voronin's hunter squint, the hopeful, lost smile of the Siberian radio operator, the collective exhaustion in the eyes of his team as they painted under the mosquito-clouded moon. He drew Anya, her ear pressed to the headset, her expression one of terrifying, focused absorption. He drew Yegorov, not as a commander, but as a sculptor, his hands shaping not clay, but perception itself. He was not drawing the illusion. He was drawing the illusionists, the broken, brilliant, damned architects of a reality that never was. They were the true ghosts, the ones who would never appear in any history of the war, whose victory was written in erased files and the silent gratitude of tens of thousands who would never know their names. The war ground on towards Berlin, a roar of metal and fire. Leonid Surov, the artist, would survive it. He would return to a world desperate to forget and rebuild. He would never speak of the 23rd Regiment. But in a small portfolio, locked away, he would keep those sketches. They were not a record of deception, but a testament to the terrifying human cost of a perfect lie. They were the portraits of the victory that could never be celebrated, the faces of the army that won the war by pretending to be won. In the end, the most powerful weapon had not been the inflatable tank or the false radio signal. It was the willingness of a few men and women to trade their piece of the truth and a part of their souls for a phantom that could save a world.